this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Lowe's knows Sundays are for football, so tackle your home improvement projects by Saturday and earn your Sunday with great deals on LG and Bosch appliances, select Bounty and Swiffer cleaning products, and more. Then once your to-do list is done, get ready to kick back, relax, and enjoy the game. Shop in-store or online now and earn your Sunday with help from Lowe's, official partner of the NFL. Wasabi is purpose-built to free your business from skyrocketing storage costs and fees. Wasabi is the go-to provider for professional and collegiate sports teams around the world. Check out Wasabi's AI-enabled intelligent media storage, Wasabi Air, to the industry's only cloud storage service with triple protection against cyber criminals. Wasabi, driving innovation in data storage for up to 80% less than market competition. Try for free at wasabi.com. Wasabi Hot Cloud Storage, proud partner of the iHeart Podcast Network.
This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 1077 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, thanks for tuning in. Last week, you heard me go over the big misses of the 2025 season. I talked through what went wrong, why it went wrong from a process standpoint, and then explained some process-oriented things that I might want to take into the 2026 season and beyond. Today, we're looking at the things that went right. It's really important to be objective when you're evaluating this side of things. It's human nature to say that you got something wrong because of bad luck, and then you got something right because you were just smart. You had the right process, you knew what was going to happen, and you predicted it right. But to me, it's really important to not get carried away with your own brilliance. Yes, as a fantasy analyst, I'm going to nail some things. But more often than not, getting something right is more just about getting something directionally right. I use this example all the time, but I was into Puka Nacua during his rookie season. He was a late round dart throw in the draft guide. He was something I was buying into heading into that year. But never in a million years did I expect him to post one of the best rookie wide receiver seasons of all time. Directionally, I was right to be in on him. But it's not like I nailed that projection. That's sort of what today's show is all about. How lucky did I get, and what's repeatable here? Because obviously, if I got things right, I want to repeat that process. So with all that being said, let's dig in. My go-to late round quarterback this year was Drake May. He ended up being my highest rostered player in redraft and in best ball. I had him ranked QB9 in my season-long rankings when ADP had him at QB16. Needless to say, that worked out. When you look at average draft position expectation and actual results, May outperformed his expected points per game by 4.6 this past year. The only quarterback that was better was Matthew Stafford. That's because he was more of an afterthought in drafts because of his back injury. Fortunately with this one, I think there's a lot of repeatable process points that we can use in future seasons. Something that's been pretty evident in my research on quarterbacks is how second-year passers, they're usually good ceiling bets in the later parts of your draft. If they're being drafted, it means they likely had an okay enough rookie season. Meanwhile, they'll usually be pushed down draft boards a bit because of the unknown. Now, that's not the case for all year two quarterbacks like Jaden Daniels this past year, and that's just because those guys had elite rookie seasons. But for a player like May, he showed signs as a rookie, but not enough signs to make the consensus feel great about him. You guys might remember, you might not remember, but I did an entire episode on how 2025 was the year of the sophomore quarterback, with Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, Drake May, Bo Nix, and maybe JJ McCarthy and Michael Penix stepping up. It didn't guarantee all of them would hit, but we were bound to see a hit or two from that group, just based on history. And Drake May was the biggest one. It wasn't just his second-year status that made him an obvious target either. Mobility was there too. May, as a rookie, averaged more rushing yards per game than Josh Allen did. There was this natural progression that we could see from him as a passer. And then we knew that the floor was there because of his rushing production, because of his athleticism. It just really came together because Drake May showed everyone that he's an awesome passer. May's an elite deep ball thrower, but there is some chance for some regression in 2026 and beyond. In other words, yeah, maybe he overperformed a bit with his 52% completion rate on 20-plus air yard throws. That's according to PFF. He was also second in yards on those throws, and he had 11 deep ball touchdowns, tying for second. That's going to be hard to repeat year in and year out. But look, I'm recording this before the conference championship games because there's this big storm coming. I don't know if I'm going to have power early next week. Maybe Drake May had an awful conference championship game. I have no idea, but I think he's the real deal. And there were at least some signals pointing to that fact before this season started. I genuinely think that this is a case where, yes, he hit a higher end outcome, but that higher end outcome was actually pretty predictable. If you go look at the responses of some of my preseason takes, the one that probably got the most attention was my stance on Chuba Hubbard. I thought Hubbard was overvalued. Not necessarily as much within the running back position, within running back rankings, but more so in overall ADP. People were just drafting him too early given his profile. And one of the things that really stood out for me with Hubbard was just how bad he'd been in yards per route run. Episode 996 talked about how yards per route run can be pretty predictive for middle round running backs. Some of the red flag backs who were under that 1.0 yards per route run mark this past year were Tyrone Tracy, who lost his job to Cam Skattebo before Cam Skattebo's injury, Brian Robinson, who was traded and irrelevant in fantasy, Tony Pollard, who was largely a bust until some spiked weeks closer to the end of the season, Ramondre Stevenson, who honestly, pretty similar story, Jordan Mason, and then Chuba Hubbard. The two who were really scary within that metric last year were Jordan Mason and Hubbard. And we saw both of them underperform versus ADP expectation. But Hubbard underperformed by 3.7 PPR points per game. That was a bottom 5 number among top 40 running backs. Hubbard's peripherals also made me buy into Rico Dowdle more, which ended up being a good call at the end of the day. We did see that backfield meet more in the middle in the late season, but Dowdle was by far the better value between those two backs this year. It wasn't even close. Now, I've largely retired from talking about the running back dead zone because that whole idea is really just an archetype thing. When players don't have good pass catching ceilings, when they're not elite, they don't have a backbone of being elite, and when they're in questionable offenses, we should generally be a little bit nervous. That was the case with Chuba Hubbard. Now, with all that being said, I won't say that I expected exactly what we saw in 2025. This is where I think the process was right, but the result favored my take more than it probably should have. Hubbard's injury was part of the reason that we saw more Rico Dowdle in the first place. I think Hubbard would have had a hard time meeting expectation regardless, but it was made even more difficult with that early season injury. The process for Hubbard, though, is the same process that I made for running back hits in the past. It's a process that can be super helpful for avoiding middle round busts or avoiding middle round running backs who aren't league winning players. Hubbard was very much a floor pick rather than a ceiling one. And that's just not the type of player that I care about in that area of the draft. George Pickens was a target of mine in this year's draft guide. He ended up outperforming ADP expectation by a ridiculous 5.5 PPR points per game. The only top 100 wide receiver picks this year who were better from that perspective were Puka Nacua, Jackson Smith-Njigba, and Rashee Rice. And Rice was only there because of a suspension that drove his cost down. CeeDee Lamb's injury definitely helped George Pickens this year from a fantasy perspective. Pickens from week 3 through week 6 averaged more fantasy points per game than any wide receiver in football. He was at 24.2. That was without CeeDee Lamb. Outside of those games, so with CeeDee Lamb, he was a little over 16 PPR points per game. But two things about that. First, 16 PPR points per game is still awesome for a wide receiver 3 draft selection. Second, contingent upside is a thing. I write about this every single year in the draft guide when talking about how we should be thinking about player projections, how it's more of a range of outcomes thing. Literally, in George Pickens' blurb, I wrote, quote, "But what happens if CeeDee Lamb goes down with an injury? We're certainly not hoping for that. Please, fantasy gods, don't let that happen. But Pickens' target share would rise dramatically in a scenario where Lamb is sidelined." And that's what we saw. What got me on Pickens was a very strong and clear previous season yards per route run trend. He'd consistently been over that 2 yards per route run mark reserved for the best players in the league. He was also shifting from a clear run-centric offense to a pass-heavy one. I wrote out all the math in the guide, but it was going to be hard for Pickens to not see a lot of volume in that offense given the shift. Meanwhile, that Dallas offense projected to be pretty good. Something that we want in our wideouts, especially those middle round wideouts. We want to avoid bad offenses. This to me was a very repeatable play. It was strong process, and it yielded a really strong result. That result may have had a little bit of luck, but even without that luck, it was a reasonable result. I did an episode in July on the tight end dead zone. It was part of the draft guide too. Over the last couple of years, I've tried to not use the dead zone phrase like I talked about earlier, because I think it dumbs things down a little bit too much. But it was the easiest way to capture how I felt about tight ends. And that's the fact that tight ends in the middle to late rounds historically, there's been no correlation between when you draft those guys and how they finish in fantasy football. As I said in the guide, between 2014 and 2024, 115 tight ends were drafted as tight end 7 through tight end 18 and then played at least 8 games. Among those 115 tight ends, there was essentially zero correlation between where they were drafted and how many PPR points per game they actually scored. And look at what happened in 2025. The elite tight ends were very clearly Brock Bowers, Trey McBride, and George Kittle from an ADP perspective. McBride absolutely crushed, Kittle played above expected when he was active, and then Bowers was a little bit iffier. But that next grouping, Sam Laporta and Travis Kelce, played barely above ADP expectation per game, but they certainly weren't league winners. And then you start to get into the traditional tight end dead zone. TJ Hawkinson, Mark Andrews, Evan Ingram, David Njoku. They were all terrible versus ADP expectation. Meanwhile, the guys who weren't were players like Tyler Warren or Tucker Kraft before his injury, Jake Ferguson, Kyle Pitts, Dallas Goedert, the guys in the lower parts of that tight end 7 to tight end 18 range. Or guys who are younger, guys who are rookies. Those are the players, if you're going to target in the higher end of that range, those are the players to go after. And that was all talked about in the guide and on that episode. So naturally, that led me to be more into guys like Tucker Kraft or Tyler Warren or Colston Loveland. I largely faded the tight ends that I had mentioned earlier, which did include Travis Kelce and Sam Laporta. My ranking saw a much bigger gap between all of those guys in the big 3 than ADP and consensus did. So once again, the tight end dead zone was a thing. And it's because drafters force inferior talent up draft boards when they don't need to. There are always plenty of tight ends to pick from late if you don't get an elite guy.
For adults with Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis symptoms, every choice matters. Tremfya offers self-injection or intravenous infusion from the start. Tremfya is administered as injections under the skin or infusions through a vein every 4 weeks, followed by injections under the skin every 4 or 8 weeks. If your doctor decides that you can self-inject Tremfya, proper training is required. Tremfya is a prescription medicine used to treat adults with moderately to severely active Crohn's disease and adults with moderately to severely active ulcerative colitis. Serious allergic reactions and increased risk of infections and liver problems may occur. Before treatment, your doctor should check you for infections and tuberculosis. Tell your doctor if you have an infection, flu-like symptoms, or if you need a vaccine. Explore what's possible. Ask your doctor about Tremfya today. Call 1-800-526-7736 to learn more or visit tremfyaradio.com.
This is Julian Edelman from Games with Names. Now let's get into the serious stuff. We're talking football food, specifically Daisy French onion dip.
That is serious.
Gotta try these delicious new dips from Daisy. These are so delicious, they're like homemade dips. Made with real herb and spices and other ingredients you'll find in your kitchen. Also made with some Daisy sour cream. Daisy sour cream is a long-standing staple for Taco Tuesday.
You know what I do? When I get my street burrito, I get the squirt Daisy.
Yeah.
And every bite. I know you.
I'm a huge sour cream guy. I love sour cream.
On top.
So I think burritos can't live without sour cream.
I completely agree with that.
They also have Daisy ranch dip. I love ranch dip.
Yeah, it's great.
I love it with crackers, wings, plain potato chip, the ones with the little crinkles, maybe some bell peppers. So get out there and give Daisy French onion dip a try. You will not regret it.
The 15 transactions show in newsletter is sort of like the targets and avoids list in the draft guide. I'm looking at the market and I'm seeing which players might be worthy of trading for or trading away. It's not an exact science because we don't have like ADP like we do at targets and avoids, but it's the closest thing I have to seeing where my head was at during a specific period of time. Back after week 1, I made an adjustment with how I felt about Chris Olave. I wasn't low on him pre-draft or anything, But it was clear after the first week that the Saints were going to run a fast-paced offense, which is what we love about Kellen Moore, and that Chris Olave was going to be heavily involved. Post week 1, I noted that no team ran at a faster pace than New Orleans, and it led to 46 pass attempts. That was more pass attempts than any Saints quarterback had in 2024. And Olave had a near 32% target share in that game. I said that Olave, quote, has a chance to be a PPR machine this year in this kind of offense. And that's basically what we saw. New Orleans actually had a negative pass rate over expected this year, but they ran over 63 plays per game. That was comfortably a top half number in the league. And Olave, he was wide receiver 7 in relevant weeks and PPR points per game. Now, one place where I think this was a little bit fortunate was with Rashid Shaheed. Shaheed left New Orleans after week 9. From weeks 1 through 9, Olave was averaging 14.1 PPR points per game. From week 10 through week 17, that number shot up to over 20. But similar to George Pickens, it's not like over 14 PPR points per game is a bad outcome for a middle round wide receiver. It's a great one. He just got better, Tyler Shuck was better than expected, and things really came together. So there's no doubt that there was a little bit of luck involved here. But I think the process of having a prior, which was Kellen Moore's offense running fast, running a lot of plays, and Olave just being a good target getter, seeing that come to fruition as early as week 1 and pouncing on that ended up being a really good call. I was a lot lower on Baker Mayfield than average draft position, and I was a lot higher on Trevor Lawrence, to the point where I made a bold prediction that Lawrence would outscore Baker Mayfield. So let's talk about those two quarterbacks next, because their stories are kind of intertwined. Baker was drafted at QB7. He played 2.4 standard fantasy points per game below expected. And this was generally the most processed play of all time for me. One of the biggest trends for quarterbacks who are drafted high in one season is if they had a high touchdown rate the previous year. If they did, they generally underperform versus expectation. It sounds backwards, but it's basically saying this quarterback is going to regress. Jared Goff was in the same boat as Baker, but Goff ended up seeing his ADP slip in the summer as it went on. Baker's didn't. Baker's ADP was QB7. And Baker started out okay, don't get me wrong. I do think there could be some injury reasons for why he fell off so hard. But guys, he was coming off a season with a 7.2% touchdown rate. A number that high rarely gets repeated year over year. And it's a number that was significantly higher than any other season of Baker's career. And to top it all off, he was losing his offensive coordinator, Liam Cohen. When you see a quarterback with a high touchdown rate being drafted early, if that quarterback doesn't have a serious rushing backbone, your inclination should probably be to avoid that quarterback. That's why I had Mayfield at QB 14 this year, behind players like Dak Prescott and Brock Purdy. And he was barely ahead of Trevor Lawrence, who I liked at QB 16. So that bold prediction that I had, it was bold from a consensus standpoint. It really wasn't that bold in my eyes at all. I had those two quarterbacks very close in rank. But the Trevor Lawrence love, it was coordinator based. That was part of it. It was the Jags getting Liam Cohen, and then Trevor Lawrence having shown us in the past that he had a higher rushing ceiling than what we saw from Baker Mayfield in that Cohen offense in 2024. So what if there was a scenario where the rushing got better under Cohen, all while Lawrence's passing numbers improved? Not only that, but one of the late round quarterback trends that I had talked about in the guide this past year surrounded fantasy points per dropback. When a quarterback had a high fantasy points per dropback in the previous season, and then he had a low ADP, that player generally outperformed ADP expectation. And T-Laws was actually not that bad as fantasy points per dropback in 2024. I'm happy with how I handled Trevor Lawrence because I bought into that upside when it made no sense to me not to given that cost. But then throughout the first half of the season on the podcast, I kept talking about how I liked what I was seeing out of Jacksonville's offense, despite the results. This is where the eye test was really helping me. I guess I'm not just a nerd living in my parents' basement after all. Now with Trevor Lawrence, there was some fortune involved. He had 9 rushing touchdowns. That's not going to repeat year over year more than likely. But the rushing upside was a key component as to why he was a target in the first place. And with Baker, yes, the injury may have played a role. This is a very repeatable process to make. High touchdown rate the previous year, question marks about how that offense might run. It would have been different had his ADP been like QB 13 or QB 14. But at QB 7, It was a really easy fade to make. One of the more controversial 15 transactions calls that I made this year was after week 11. Josh Allen was coming off a game against the Buccaneers where he had over 300 passing yards and 3 touchdowns through the air, and then another 40 yards and 3 touchdowns on the ground. He was a madman. And then, of course, I called him a sell. He was at a high point of the season. There's almost zero chance, even if it's Josh Allen, there was almost a zero chance he was going to repeat that performance. My beef with him was mostly the playoff schedule that he had in fantasy. Week 16 and 17 saw him with matchups at Cleveland, and then Buffalo faced Philadelphia in Buffalo. And that Cleveland game proved to be his worst outing of the season from a fantasy perspective. His Week 17 game was fine enough because of some late game heroics, but Allen burned a lot of fantasy teams with that Week 16 performance. And in the fantasy playoffs, those 3 weeks, Allen was a low-end QB1 in points per game. That's replacement level when you consider streaming. The lesson here, I think, is to not be afraid of making a move like that, especially at quarterback, because we know those performances are going to be a little bit more predictable. They are going to fall in line a little bit more with what the schedule is telling us. It's always scary to sell after a monster game, but that's often how you win out in the biggest way. The place I want to end today's discussion is with Jerry Jeudy. People forget that Jeudy was a fringe top 30 wide receiver in drafts this year. But he had one of the worst seasons in fantasy football versus expectation. He played 5 PPR points per game below expected, which is wild when your expectation isn't like a first or second round pick. The expectation wasn't even that high to begin with. Jeudy was being boosted in ADP by a previous season that showed fantasy production in a lot of volume. But as I talked about over the summer, nothing had fundamentally changed about Jerry Jeudy as a player. And some of his splits were really, really alarming. For example, outside of playing with Jameis Winston in 2024, Jerry Jeudy averages 9.3 PPR points per game and a 21% target share. Cedric Tillman was also out for an extended period of time in 2024. When Tillman was active, Jerry Jeudy had a lower PPR point per game output than when Tillman was out. So then entering 2025, Tillman was healthy, the Browns had added Harold Fannin. It was hard to assume Jeudy would just lead the league again in routes run like he did in 2024. He got by purely on volume in 2024, and I didn't want to bank on that for a non-elite player. Now, clearly that result worked out. Jeudy was a horrific middle round pick. But the funny thing about that process was that Jeudy was still 6th in the NFL in routes run this past year. It just goes to show that when you need a lot of things to align for a player to hit, even if one of those things does go right, things can still go wrong. Jeudy was in a projected bad offense. He didn't have amazing previous season peripherals. And yes, I expected some regression in the routes run department. And there was regression in routes run, even if he still finished high. He ran significantly fewer routes year over year. So to me, the lesson with Jerry Jeudy, don't buy into big performances when an environment was really great for a player, even if it was within a bad offense or at least a mediocre offense. Because when that player has given us nothing historically to say that he's elite, he's probably not going to be elite year over year. Now, just like the things that I whiffed on episode, there were a lot of things here that I didn't get to. It's always interesting talking to listeners and hearing what it was that either helped them or hurt them this year. And that thing sometimes not even being on my radar. But I thought that this gave us a good sample of some of the good parts of 2025, with a lot of repeatable processes to help us out in 2026. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are best searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll catch you next time.
This is Julian Edelman from Games with Names. Now let's get into the serious stuff. We're talking football food, specifically Daisy French onion dip. These are so delicious, they're like homemade dips. Made with real herb and spices, also made with some Daisy sour cream. Daisy sour cream is a long-standing staple for Taco Tuesday. They also have Daisy ranch dip. So get out there and give Daisy French onion dip a try. You will not regret it.
This episode is brought to you in part by Uber Eats. Every time you sit down to watch the game, you find yourself getting a little hungry. Football and food just go together. Good thing Uber Eats has game day deals all season long. We're talking savings on your favorite eats and snacks, wings, pizza, chips, drinks, you name it. Whether it's from your favorite restaurant or straight from the grocery store, Uber Eats has deals on everything you need for game day. Get game day deals on Uber Eats. Order now.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.